celebrate many unsung heroes. This is real talk, real news, real people, all the time. Tune in to the podcast and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Souls of Many. Welcome to the Souls of Many podcast. This is your host, Bridget Chapman Lewis. Today, we'll be talking about a very important topic that's all the rage in the United States and around the world, and that is the criminal justice system. We have a great guest today. His name is Dan Collins, and he's from the law offices of Dan Collins, and that's located in Wheaton, Illinois. I'll give you a little background on Dan, and I want you to understand that this particular podcast episode is really near and dear to my heart. I know it's near to Dan's heart, and we are just trying to, fix what's broken and having the audience chime in or making you aware of what the criminal justice system actually is, what's right with it, and what's broken with it. And hopefully we can offer some remedy or reconciliation at some point and get everyone involved. So with that said, let's introduce the attorney, Dan Collins. Following his Navy service, Dan graduated with his BA in history from Norfolk State University in 1994 and his JD in 1998 from Thomas M. Cooley Law School. Dan has been practicing criminal defense for over 22 years, starting as a student in the Cook County Public Defender's Office Juvenile Division to a law firm. He now has his own practice dedicated solely to criminal defense. Dan has taken over 100 cases to jury trial and well over 100 bench trials. That's pretty impressive. From alleged murder charges to ordinary DUIs and theft, Dan has dedicated his career to leaving no one to stand alone before the bar of justice. That is impressive. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for having me here today, Bridget. It's good to see you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want the audience to know as well that if I were in trouble and I needed a great consult or I needed great advice, this would be my first go-to. Dan, I've been knowing him for a number of years relative to the criminal justice system, and he is frank, he is honest, he is passionate about what he does, but more important, he's very good at what he does. You can find lawyers a dime a dozen these days as accountants and so forth, but you can't find very good ones, very dedicated ones that are just passionate about our system, how to make it better, and how to get reconciliation and resolve, proper reconciliation and resolve. So, as he says, he doesn't like to leave anyone standing alone. And so he takes that stand and he takes a mighty one for all of his clients. So again, welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you.
With that said, we're going to roll right into the purpose of this episode, criminal justice system, and give you some statistics. Okay? I'll be citing several sources, and my sources come from the United States Census, The Week, which is a UK publication, which has editions printed here and online in the United States and the UK. I'll be citing sources from the Washington Post, as well as Brennan Center for Justice, which is an NYU bipartisan law and public policy publication. So, as always on the Souls of Many, we keep it real with real talk, real news, real people all the time, and we bring you the facts, okay? So, with that said, let's talk a little bit about the United States of America and the criminal justice system because it is really broken. Okay, so let's say we are about 4.7% of the world's population, which is, the world's population is a little bit over 7 billion people. The United States has 330 million people approximately and growing, but it's very small, relatively speaking, comparatively speaking as well, to the world population of 7 billion people. So if you take 330 million and you divide that by the 7 billion, you come up with a percentage of about 4.7% of the world's population. And some will round that up and say we're 5% of the world's population. So given that fact and statistic, out of the United States, we have 25% of the world's incarcerated. That's astounding to me. There's 7 billion people in the world, yet we are 1/4 of the world's population with only 4.7% in population statistics. So that said, also moving more with the United States Census information, let's take a look at the wealth and income inequality gap. Okay, so we've got 330 million people here approximately. 76% of those people are considered white. 18% are considered now Latinx, which includes Latino, Latina, and Hispanic population, but I guess the politically correct term now is Latinx. They're 18% of the population, and that includes last census, which was undocumented and documented. Okay? Moving to the Black population, it's 13.4% of that 330 million people, and Asians considered have a population of about 6%. Okay, let's break those numbers down a little bit further. 76% of the population equates to
251 million white people.
18% of the population here in the United States equates to about 59 million people, and that's the Latinx. 13.4%, which is the Black population, is about 50 million people, and the Asian population of 6% is 20 million people. Okay, let's further dissect that. Let's look at the poverty rate. Whites, 7%, Hispanics, 16%, Blacks, 19%. Okay, they lead the poverty in this country. Out of the 7%, that equates to 18 million white people that are impoverished. Hispanics, that equates to 9.4 million impoverished. That's Hispanics, which is now politically correct term is Latinx. But these statistics are taken from the United States Census. Blacks, 19%. That's 9.5 million impoverished people. So I hope you see where I'm going with this. There are more impoverished white people in this country than combined of Hispanics and Blacks, yet 25% of the world's incarcerated, and Black people are 5 times more likely in the incarceration system, or 5 times the population in our incarceration system. So that's pretty telling to me. Now, with this Brenning study that they did from the Brenning Center for Justice at NYU. I'm going to read a little bit to you because I have to present the fact before we get into the dialogue. They're well researched and they're bipartisan. So I wanted you to understand that as well. Okay, America is approaching a breaking point. For more than 4 decades, economic inequality has risen tremendously, stunting productivity, weakening our democracy, and leaving tens of millions struggling to get by in the world's most prosperous country. Goes on to add, this year's intertwined emergencies of the pandemic, as well as poverty and the inequality gaps, have also driven home a reality that some would rather ignore. That growing gap between the rich and poor is a result of not just the world's market's invisible hand, but a set of deeply misguided policy choices. And another point that they point out in this forward is the number of people incarcerated in America today is more than 4 times larger than it was in 1980. And we know in 1980 we had some very misguided policy. And Dan and I will talk to you about that a little bit later. But that was the war on drugs, et cetera, and it disproportionately impacted communities of color. Mass incarceration has been a key instrument in voter suppression. That's also a point that they make in this study that they came up with. Meanwhile, a nationwide reckoning over deep-rooted racial injustice is forcing our country to come to terms with the ways in which these injustices have been perpetuated in the country and have since the end of slavery. So you do understand, I talk about this in prior podcasts, that since the Civil War, nothing has really changed in regards to inequality and disparity, except for the civil rights movement and bumping incomes up just a bit. But the study goes on to introduce this. America's 400 year of racial injustice continues to produce profound economic inequalities, a reality our society must no longer ignore. The net worth of a typical white family, for example, is 10 times that of a typical Black family. Shockingly, despite the successes of the civil rights movement, this racial wealth gap has barely changed in the last half century. At the same time, as we are all too aware, the criminal justice system subjects Americans to profoundly unequal treatment. A century ago, a Black man was 4 times as likely as a white man to be incarcerated. In 1980, around the height of the war on drugs, he was 11 times as likely. Black men and women are also jailed at more than triple the rate of white men and women. And nearly half of all people serving effective life sentences are Black. Disparate enforcement is one reason. For example, the majority of people stopped in New York City's controversial stop and frisk program were Black. Perhaps most disturbingly, Black men and women are far more likely to be the victims of police use of force. The protests that erupted in the spring of 2020, catalyzed by the Black Lives Matter movement, was indicative of this. So these are just some things that, our country is looking at right now, and some things that we need to change. The Black Lives Matter movement highlighted the disparities in our criminal justice system. And we saw this after the Black Lives Matter movement started with a hashtag, and it went viral. And with that viral hashtag, it was seen all over the world. Hence, that's why you see the movement all over the world. So there are some things that are just inherently broken in our system and that are just gross disparities in the criminal justice system. I want to read 2 more key points. And it states that the staggering racial disparities in our criminal justice system flow directly into our economic inequality. And I've been blogging about this for years. Some people say, well, people need to stop being so lazy and get a job and pull up by their bootstraps. And I constantly remind them that sometimes you don't have the boots to pull up with. You can't stand. You got the straps, but you don't have the boots. Or you might not have the straps, but you have the boots. It's 6 or 1/2 dozen of another sometimes. And we'll get into that a bit as well. These consequences are magnified and reinforced throughout a lifetime of discrimination in employment and access to economic opportunity. So for those of you out there that think that things are so equal and so fair and we've come a long way, yes, we've come a long way in regards to the denouncement of slavery and the Civil War and trying to make things better for the country, but we've got so much further to go. These disparities still exist. And last, earnings losses worsen economic disparities between Black, Latino, and white communities. It's pretty appalling and staggering when you get into the statistics and really know what's behind all of these things. And it's just deep-rooted racial imbalance and inequality and disparities in disenfranchising folks and so forth. And now there's such a light on it with this Black Lives Matter movement. And some folks don't even understand the movement. And I explained that in a prior podcast, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But I want to go through another statistics. I look at the Appalachians, and The Appalachians span from Kentucky to New York, Virginia, etc. So Pennsylvania, it's a vast demographic. And there it's very, very poor. The Week called it in the paper, their heading and their headline for this particular article was called Appalachia, the Big White Ghetto. And they compared it similarly to urbanism and the ghettos in urbanism, but they're different in that Appalachia can be more rural and it's less population dense, so you don't get what you get in a population dense society in urbanism. So the crime is a little bit different. It can be predictable. Because the communities sometimes are smaller, so you can identify the crime right away and stay on top of it. Unlike in big urban centers, it's so population dense and there's so many moving parts to crime and poverty and so forth. That's where it begins to differ. And so what I did want to make mention, though, and point out is that much like the Appalachian poor, the urban poor had a big drug problem in addition to the poverty. And so there's an opioid addiction that's going on now that is just ravaging our country. And before that, while it was a war on drugs, there was a big cocaine problem, and then a crack cocaine problem, and a crank problem, and a heroin addiction problem. But no one seemed to pay attention to it because the government imposed this war on drugs, and it was just a wrong policy. It was just a wrong policy. And so folks were mass incarcerated as a result of that. Families were separated. There was gross impoverishment, and communities suffered as a result of it. Now in the Appalachians and across the United States, you've got this opioid addiction, and much of it stems to heroin addiction and so forth. But the bigger point that I want to bring to the audience is that there's a big government initiative around the opioid addiction to stop, one, the crime, and two, to stop the deaths from happening in such a cycle. So there's that right there alone. The war on drugs was a wrong policy, and now you're trying to right-size it, and it's with the opioid addiction. But the opioid addiction is mostly in white impoverished communities, and now it's even filtered over into wealthy white communities because that's a cleaner drug of choice and a quicker drug of choice for some teens, et cetera. But it's a big problem. So when it affects and it impacts your community, that's when you get the attention. But most impoverished communities don't get that type of attention. So the government is all about it right now as far as trying to stop this opioid addiction and stop their kids and kids at large from just dropping down, and adults as well. But it's a big problem with teenagers, a big, big problem with teenagers. So I just wanted to highlight that. I could talk about that all day, and that's not what this particular podcast is really about. I just wanted to point out some of the disparities and give you real live statistics on those disparities so that you know what this country looks like from an impoverished and a crime standpoint. Now we can jump right into your thoughts on the criminal justice system and what I just went through, Dan. I appreciate your commentary, so you can have at it at this point.
Let's start off with at the criminal justice system where I believe the very start of the focus should be, and let's go back to the war on drugs, because I think that's where we started, where we started to see the beginning of mistakes. The war on drugs introduced mandatory minimum sentencings, where we saw that crack cocaine was differentiated from powder cocaine, and it introduced mandatory minimums. That's where we started to see the separation of families. That's where we started to see no discretion on the part of judges. If you were arrested for a certain amount of crack cocaine, you automatically got 9 to 15 years. Those laws are still on the books. those laws where I'm going to use Illinois law as an example today for a first offender. I'm just going to use an example where I see a substantial amount of our problems today are with mandatory minimums across the board. Something that and this goes in. This is a lot of what you were talking about with your goes back to the war on drugs. Goes back that we started back in 1993 with that major crime bill with the crack cocaine differentiation between powder cocaines, where you had those penalties that if you were caught with crack cocaine, you were automatically given 6 to 30 years in the penitentiary and separated from your families, that the judge had no discretion. Those type of laws are still on the books today. Those laws that took the discretion away from the judge. You could be a first offender, a person with no criminal history at all. And the next thing you know, you're looking at 6 to 30 years in the Department of Corrections. You could be looking at, for a good example today, a good example of today's law would be a young man who finds himself with no history with a firearm offense. Again, I don't want to detract from the seriousness of a firearm offense, but a stupid mistake. A firearm has an automatic 15-year add-on for a young man today or a young woman today. 15 years. 15 years with no discretion on the part of a judge.
Wow.
This is where we have the legislature stepping in and adding these draconian automatic sentencing with no discretion on the part of the judge, cannot take into consideration the immaturity of the defendant, the economic situation of the defendant, or the lack of social. Again, you just went through so many factors that could be taken in mitigation. Somebody's socioeconomic background, the plight of the family, where they're coming from. All of these factors are socioeconomic factors that have an impact on the way an individual grows up, the way an individual sees the world, the way an individual makes decisions that can be corrected, that can be realigned, that can be changed, that are worth investing in an individual within our society. Yet the legislature, in responding to the fear, has chosen to make it place them in the penitentiary for such a period of time that destroys an individual's life. We've got to start with our criminal justice system with reform, with examining mandatory minimum sentencing. And again, that goes back to the war on drugs. It's all started with the mandatory minimum sentencing with the war on drugs. You start off with the drug offenses and you look at the mandatory minimum sentence. That's got to be the first place you look at when you're going to examine any type of criminal justice reform, because that in and of itself is going to affect our incarceration rates.
Wow. That's pretty profound. When I look at the war on drugs, that was back, I can clearly remember the faces and the campaigns and so forth in the administration. And I was thinking, okay, so yeah, drugs have ravaged these communities. I think the intentionality may have been good for the sake of the country, but it was just a wrong-headed policy. You did not understand those communities to even enforce a policy, let alone come up with legislation. And so if you don't understand the fiber of the community and what's going on, how in the heck can you write legislation around something and put it in as a mandatory? That's nuts.
Yes, I agree with you that it was the easy solution for a much larger problem than you were confronting. It was the easy, pretty solution that made everybody happy at the time. But man, the devastation. The effect, you were absolutely, the devastating effect that you were having, the mass incarceration, the destruction of families, the destruction of neighborhoods. You've had an entire generation to look at its effects. It's time to say no. This is the sociological, the societal effects outweigh. It's not stopping the problem. It's not. It hasn't had any effect.
It has had a negative effect, if anything, because
that's absolutely
with that mass incarceration, there were so many families separated and divided and so forth, and they did not understand where the drugs were coming from in the first place. And so today, there's a different drug trafficking, so to speak, and where drugs are coming from. Back in the day, they started with the mob, the Italian mob, and so forth, and they infiltrated these communities. Just crazy. Well, Prohibition was over. You know, you couldn't bootleg anymore, and you couldn't run all these rings that you were running. So they got into the drug trade, and then they had these impoverished communities. They came up with this interesting theory that, you know, they could make a buck, and, you know, they get everybody hooked on it. And, you know, once they start tasting the drug, it would just be hard to pull back. It was a money-making machine. It was an enterprise. And so it infiltrated these communities, and gangs started organizing around it, and it just went crazy. But it all stemmed from such an impoverishment of these communities and making money on the communities and showing these communities how to make a way and how they could make money, because all the jobs had left their community. So it was just a dynamic that was just extraordinary. But if you did not understand that dynamic, how could you write legislation to the extent that it was written and leave it on the books to this date, to this day? And so every once in a while, you'll toss a community a bone. You know, on the south side of Chicago, you'll put a Whole Foods there. You know, you'll put a Starbucks there. And that always amazed me, because I think that was politically motivated and inspired. Whole Foods was, you know, a sexy grocer at the time. And so it was like, are you kidding me? Look at the needs of these people. While I certainly appreciate the job opportunity, it was a handful of jobs, comparatively speaking, to Nabisco that left that had 600 jobs. So when you look at it like that, you've got to put more jobs and more programs in the community to stop the poverty and stop these crazy cycles of crime. But at any rate, I can talk about that all day, but we're here to talk about the criminal justice system and what's broken and what's right.
And let's stay focused on where we can start where we can look at to reform. And a lot of that reform's got to come with your legislature. The legislature's got to make opportunities available for judges to do the right things. They've got to give them sentencing alternatives. They've got to give they've got to do something about to give opportunities available to the judges to make sure that the future is still available to these defendants. So a lot of times, I just want to make a point here that I think is really important. A lot of my practice isn't so, there's two important aspects to criminal defense. One is the determination of guilt or innocence, and everybody has a right to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. You have a right for a determination of that by a jury of 12 individuals, or a judge, a jury trial or a bench trial. But there's also a part of my practice that has to do, once you're determined guilty, what is the appropriate outcome of that case? And that's where I look at sentencing alternatives. What can I do to restore you to useful citizenship? What can I do to prevent this crime from going on your permanent record? What can I do about the man that I'm going to be looking at 30 years old? What can I do to make you the best man that you can possibly be at 40 years old? What can we do to have this felony put off your record in 5 years? And there are things that the legislature has done that I can make you, at the man at 30, not have this on your record. And there's got to be more of those programs out there for everybody in our community. We've got to do something to give these people their lives back and not put that felony on their record for the rest of their lives. There's a reason that we put pencils on erasers, and we cannot condemn these people for an entire lives. They make stupid mistakes when they're 20, 25 years old, but they're fathers at 30. They're men at 35, and they need to have careers when they're 40.
Dan, you brought up so many important issues. Let me try to break those down at the root of the criminal justice system in trying to get to reform. You mentioned that judges have got to be given some latitude to get away from these mandatory sentences and so forth. How do we get at that?
The legislature has to make it available to us. I want to just bring one to your attention that I was so proud of the legislature for last year. A first offender gun probation, which I was over the moon. I was so proud of the legislature. They just made it available, and it did target the black community for young men under the age of 21 who were just caught with their first offender gun. It's called first offender gun probation. Under the 21, no criminal history, who got caught with their first gun. It's a chance for them to be placed on this probation. If they go to school, do some community service, they can have a gun case taken off their record if they don't get in any trouble. Do you know how many young black men that's going to give them a chance for a life at 25? Do you know how many young men that could change the entire trajectory of their life?
Absolutely. Dan, let me make you aware of a situation, and I want to ask you too in regards to that particular piece of legislation. Are all attorneys aware of that represent their clients?
I can't answer for all attorneys. I know that a lot of my practice, I spend a lot of my practice. Not only is there determination of guilt, but man, so much of my time is spent. I go to a lot of a lot of times I present my clients to the judge. My clients are human beings. Like you said in my introduction, I stand beside my clients and I present a human being to the judge, not just that human being who's sitting there at the sentencing, but I present the human being that I want to present to that judge in 5 years. And there are sentencing alternatives. I do know that you've got to study this. They have a duty to keep themselves educated on what comes through the legislature. And yes, they should know these. They should know those statutes as they're changed, as they keep going. I'm gonna give my fellow colleagues the presumption of knowing those statutes. They have a duty to know those. They have a duty to know that the expungement statutes are changing, that what can be expunged. They have a duty to know the specialized programs that are being updated by the legislature. But that's where we're going to see change. The change is going to come from a few places. It's going to come from the legislature. The legislature is the ones giving us those opportunities for those specialized types of probations, and that's where there's going to be substantive change. Also, you don't know how important it is to put a progressive prosecutor in office. I bring to example the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. They had such a horrible reputation in that office, such a horrible reputation. And they have made some changes in that office with a progressive prosecutor, somebody who will actively look and police the police, somebody who will examine the police conduct and hold them accountable at an appropriate standard. That's such a breath of fresh air. Let me just stay with what the legislature can do for you. But that involves community activism. That involves saying, no, we're going to save our young men. We expect you. We expect you to be compassionate and give us our young men back and give us their future back. We expect you to. We expect you not to scar them for life for mistakes that can be corrected.
Go ahead.
That's what I would ask from the legislature. We expect you to hold them accountable for their conduct, but not to scar them for the rest of their life. That's what I would ask from the legislature. In any situation where we can do that, let's do that with our criminal justice system. Let's do that across the board. Let's not make it permanent scars. Let's be a rehabilitative focused and a restorative focused criminal justice system, a restorative focus. Let's restore them to a place within our society where they're back to being 100% of a citizen.
Absolutely. Functioning citizens at that. That's a lot of information, and I almost don't know where to go with it. But when you talk about Philly, could that be a business, not a business model, but just a model for legislators across the country to take a look at when they're examining criminal justice and police reform?
It is, and yes, it absolutely could be. It absolutely could be. Yes, and again, he's become a very popular speaker with what he's done with his office. It's been a political hot potato with the reform at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, but we're evolving into a different issue, and that's police accountability for their own conduct. Let's say that is a different issue, because that's most certainly another aspect of criminal justice reform. Let's close out the issue with legislative reform and say that let's close that issue out and say that's a huge aspect. Both the state and federal legislature could take an incredible responsibility with criminal justice reform, with just passing legislation that gives people those chances, both at the state and federal levels. It's quite within their power. With one, Black Lives Matter now has a seat at the table. The founder of Black Lives Matter is now a member of the House of Representatives from the state of Missouri. She's got a voice. The Biden administration is good. The incoming administration, I hope that they'll allow more progressives into the administration. But there is no question at all the role that there's no question at all that progressives did play a role in the election of this president. It's their responsibility now to not let up the pressure. If you want this reform, you've got to maintain, not especially at the state level, you've got to maintain that pressure, especially on your local legislatures. You expect that reform. You've got to keep that momentum moving forward at this time. That's the only thing that's going to keep you. That's the only thing that's going to make change happen. Is keeping that pressure moving forward.
Right. So when we look at state legislators, I think that some of our politicians are just busy being busy, and they're not focusing on anything. It's just the hot point of the day, literally. And not the focus of what really should be happening and how to change it. So that's what I'm trying to get to. And you're making some really excellent points. So judges being given the latitude to stop the mandatory sentencing and come up with alternatives through legislation that can go on the books. That's really important. Taking away a felony record for first offenses of something like a gun charge, and ruining and devastating people's lives for the rest of their lives is another thing that can happen. Taking a look at Philadelphia and what they did and kind of model towards that. I know every state legislature and every state is different, but some of these things you can take from what has been implemented and is impactful and make a significant change. And I think that that's where we need to start from a federal level. Out of the 435 legislators in Congress, I really think that they should start focusing. Coronavirus is one thing, and the packaging of the stimulus and the next bill that's coming across the table, that's one thing to focus on, and that's a big thing because this pandemic is just really, really tearing this country apart, not to mention the deaths. And God, I feel for each and every one. Everybody knows someone that's been impacted, just like everybody probably knows someone that has been impacted with the criminal justice system. I think that these are the top two priorities in addition to the economy. But I think if we focus on getting what's right with this pandemic so that we can get our economy rolling again and getting the criminal justice system fixed and police reform, just getting those things under control, I think we'll have a fantastic community, a fantastic economy I mean, and that at the end of the day is so worth it, because if you have a great economy and you've got a great community, you've got a great country. We already have a great country. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else on this planet. I love this country, but there's so many things that need to be fixed. And at the top three, I just named them. And we've got to get going on it. So I implore Congress, legislators at the state level, and our senators to focus, and get these things done. People are hurting. People are dying. People are struggling. This is impacting lives. And a human life has no monetary value. I mean, it is exponentially beyond a monetary value if you can wrap your comprehension around that. And we've got to fix this.
I think this was the most important summer since the Freedom Riders summer of 1961. I think this was more than a generational summer. I think this was the summer where you had to make a decision whether you were going to be. It was that important of a summer. What side were you going to be a freedom rider this summer, or whether you were not going to be a freedom rider? I'm referring back to the summer of 1961. It was that type of a summer. You were going to choose, as it was that important of a summer. I think the criminal justice was it's the summer of social justice reform, and everybody has to make a decision. But however, for those of us who are social justice reform minded, we have a right to be disturbed by those elections, right? Because the Democrats did wonderful at the top of that ticket, but at the bottom, from the rest of that ticket down, we have something. We should be concerned about that. We have a right to be concerned about the way those racists were on the bottom of that ticket. We have a right to be concerned by that, and we have a right to, after looking at those results, we have a right to be more. We should use that as motivation to be more involved and to be more motivated that our message needs to go further. That we need to be just as committed to keep moving forward, because we should not use the win at the top of the ticket to think that we have won, that it's just going to go easy for us from this point forward. We need to be motivated by the results of this election to continue to move.
I agree. From a legislative standpoint, if nothing else, when you look at who won seats and who's not at the table, but who's in the party now, and I mean our House, the 435, it was just amazing in 2016 at how some of the progressives came to the table. It was amazing. You saw wave after wave after wave. That's the people speaking. So in my opinion, those people need a voice. They're in the House now. The people spoke for them. They put them there. They want their voices heard. So to your point, now that there's a new administration coming in, there needs to be a little bit more inclusion as far as seats at the table. And people need to start listening. You can't have just more of the same, which brings experience and all of these wonderful things and procedural and protocol things. But some things we got really wrong. We really got a lot of things wrong. So in order to get it right, you've got to listen. And you've got to listen to new voices that are representative of the people so that you can get it right. Because there's so many things and so many gross inequities and disparities, and our criminal justice system is just broken. It's broken. And it's got to be fixed. And if there's anything that I can do about it, I will advocate all day long about it, because I've seen it up close and personal in action. You know, I speak in a prior podcast episode how I was on a jury trial, and it was in a predominantly white suburb. It happened to be Cook County, which is where Chicago is also. And the police were from Cook County. And they were going to run this man under the bus, the whole jury, because they didn't want to pay attention to the evidence. They're just so used to making decisions based on what their peer is saying and wanting to get along and wanting to go home, that they were going to send a guy to jail for a very long time for attempted murder, for assaulting police officers, and the evidence was not there to support it. But I think it was just the perception that this is what happens and this is who this man is, and he's, in that community. But then breaking down the community over the evidence and this woman's home, it was immaculate. She was raised nice, and he had a mental illness. He did not attempt to murder these people. No evidence whatsoever depicted that. And they all went around the table. I was the only African American, not that I'm there to, sway a vote towards African Americans at all. As I've said before, I don't care what you look like. If you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, you're right. But we've got to start looking at things for what they are. And if there's reasonable doubt, which it was overwhelming, then you should not be sending people to jail. You should not. And the evidence and the prosecutor, and it was just astounding at what I saw. But the jury, it took hours to turn their headset around based on the evidence, which I'm grateful that they did see it for what it was. But initially, it was less than 30 minutes after getting instruction that they all wanted to send this guy to jail. And it stopped with a musician who was thinking out of the box because he's used to cultural dynamic and he's seen other things. And then they stopped at me and I said, I cannot and will not unless we don't have any more evidence here, that was presented. If they're going to bring in more evidence, then fine, I'll weigh that evidence. But what we have here clearly is reasonable doubt. And in a matter of hours, they all changed their mind and said, yes, there is reasonable doubt. And I said, before you say there's reasonable doubt, I don't want you to say it because you think I'm convincing. I want you to present the reasonable doubt. And I wasn't the foreman. And I said, but first the foreman has to agree to that, because we're stepping outside of the bounds here. And I don't want to be the foreman. But I want to know what your thoughts are in regards to the facts. And they all went around and said, yeah, this happened, that happened, multiple things equating to reasonable doubt. But had I not been there and had that musician not been there, this man who had a mental illness, who did not attempt to murder these cops, and they cooked up this story, took 3 months to put the report together with a 45-year-old vet out of the city of Chicago. He put the report together, and he was notoriously known for interrogative things that weren't proper, for lack of a better word. And I said to myself, this is just all kind of wrong here. But anyways, those things happen so often every day in our criminal justice system. And I just wonder, when does it stop? When does it stop? How can we fix this?
Your question, that's there is an answer for what your question is, and that's a question about police oversight and police control. The absolute first thing that must be done with that has to be addressed to police unions. You must have some control over police unions. The legislature has to take control of police unions. Police unions they have absolute and unequivocal control. And until you are able to get some control over police unions and their role, you will absolutely, there's no repercussions for that conduct. You will not get the blue wall. It's the blue wall. You will not get past that blue wall until there is some control over police unions, until there's some accountability for their conduct, until they are held accountable for their conduct, there will be no change in that conduct.
How do you get at that? The unions are so powerful, and rightfully so. I'm a union girl. I believe in unions. I really do. But there is such a level of corruption in these unions.
I'm a union person as well. But is there for publics as a public service? Are they doing a disservice to the public by the formation of a union for that purpose? Are they? I think there's
that way.
I think there's an argument to be made that a police union that I think there's an argument to be made that a police union ultimately serves a disservice to the public. They theoretically are engaging in conduct that doesn't do a service to the public. They could be hiding. They're hiding. You see the conduct that they're engaging in as a result of the formation of a union. I honestly do think that it's something that should be debated by our legislature. It's something that is most certainly something that should be scrutinized by our legislature. And I think I'm most certainly something that deserves a lot more scrutiny than we've given it. Most certainly.
Are our legislators the only ones that can break that down and have the union really looked at and come up with rules that make more sense?
I think it would take the legislatures, and it would have to. The legislatures or the courts would have to most certainly step in to address it would take an act of legislation to address to make them non-existent any longer. It most certainly would take an act of legislation. It most certainly would probably take some negotiation as well. But for the public good, I think that's something that, especially at this point in time, that's something that most certainly is something worth public discussion over the existence of police union as well as immunity. That's most certainly something worth discussing as well. Immunity from prosecution for police officers. That's something that's worthy for discussion. And there's also something worthy to discussion as the prosecutor's relationship for that conduct as well. What's if a police officer is going to engage in that conduct, knowing that he's not going to be prosecuted for that conduct, that says something for him. That says something as well. There's got to be accountability there. That's something that's got to be addressed with the state's attorney's office or with the prosecuting authority's office.
That's very true, and that's what I thought about when I was on this particular jury trial. That the prosecutor was flabbergasted, just dumbfounded that she lost. She just could not believe it. So much so that the judge delivered our checks to us and asked us what would it have taken? He just didn't understand. He said, what would it have taken to get a guilty verdict? Now, this man had never been in the criminal justice system before. I could see if he was a notorious, offender and a really bad offender. I get it, a little bit, why he would question it. But he was questioning a first-time offender accused of attempted murder of a police officer with a mental illness the evidence did not suggest that. And they were just dumbfounded that the jury just did not convict this guy. That blew me away. It just sunk my heart. I got in my car and I drove home and I cried. And I said, what is wrong with this country? What is wrong with people? Why are they doing this to people? It's almost as though it's a skill set. It's a craft. It's a game. It is not a game to manipulate a human being's life. It is not.
Yes, and I agree with you. And then I don't want to call it a game because it's my profession. Like I said, I stand beside people who I know it's their life. I know that when a person who I'm standing beside, I know the sound of hand. I stand beside people when that jury returns a verdict. The worst sound in my life is when those handcuffs. I know the sound of when a jury returns that verdict of guilty, and that deputy who comes over and stands behind my client, and he clicks those sounds of those handcuffs, and they're going to go into custody. Then it's not a game. It's somebody's life. I know that they're not going home to their family that night. I know that a family's life is altered at that point, permanently altered. They're never going to get that time back. I hope that everybody in the room is taking it as seriously as I am at that point, but I don't know if they are.
And that's to my point. I think that some of these things have just become routine, that people have become numb to what's going on. And so they push the paper and they're on to the next case. And for jurors, citizens of this country, I just implore everyone that does a jury a duty to take it seriously.
And I hear so many times that we've got the best system on the face of the earth, and I also want to encourage other people that we're also capable of we're capable of studying systems as well too. Again, where we should be students of other systems. Well, there are other models of policing out there as well. There's European models of policing that I think would be we would be wise to study those models, especially for large metropolitan areas. London has a wonderful model of policing that de-escalates a lot of the military styles of policing that we use in our large cities, and they use a much less militaristic model of policing in London that creates a very, very interesting interaction between their police and their citizenry, and for European models, that might be something that we could incorporate here in the United States, or maybe some ideas from European models of policing that should be brought to the United States. Mm-hmm. That would be that's something that I think would most certainly de-escalate the tensions between the population of the United States and their policing agencies. That's something we always have a tendency to say this is the greatest system in the world. I don't know if it is the greatest system in the world. I think there are other models out there, both in the criminal justice system, even in the jury trial systems. I think we could be students and learn from other systems, and maybe even implement maybe even consider studying some other systems.
That's a very, very, very valid point. You know,
I apologize, and I'm going to criticize the jury system here for a second. We use a jury trial system where we bring in 12 citizens from the community who have no experience in criminal justice, and we ask them to come in and make determinations of witness credibility. We ask them to weigh the test. We give them a jury instruction that tells them to weigh the testimony of a police officer, not just the same as they're supposed to weigh the average testimony of an average individual. They're given an actual jury instruction for that purpose. Yet that goes against everything that we're taught as where we're brought up from the moment where, as a child, if you're in trouble, go to a police officer. You know, we know how we're taught to treat police officers in society,
and
to trust police officers.
Yes.
And you did a jury trial. You were a juror. You saw how the other 11 jurors gave him what the cop said goes. That's the bottom line. And no ifs, ands, or buts. He said it. That's what it is. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense.
And yet we also know that Testilying is one of the fundamental problems we have with police officers. You're familiar with the term Testilying, correct?
Explain that to the audience.
Testilying is a term that's a fundamental problem, and I don't want to accuse police officers or anything, but it's Testilying is when you get on the stand and you're testifying, but you're lying through your teeth, and it's such a known common problem with police officers that it's called Testilying. They do it so often.
Oh my gosh, it's like second nature. We have these young police officers on the stand. Just
and it's such a known thing in the community that it's called Testilying. Now, in the criminal, it's called that in the criminal justice community. Wouldn't you feel better having a jurist who's familiar with this concept of Testilying being on the panel deciding your guilt or innocence? Shouldn't there be somebody back there in the deliberations going, well, are we sure that shouldn't that be taken into consideration in our deliberations, that we know that these police officers have a tendency to really exaggerate the facts? And I'm going to give you an example of this from an indictment that just came down yesterday, that I'm really having a problem with. I don't know if you're familiar with Grandmaster Jay. There was the militia movements. Are you familiar with the militia movements?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the NFAC, the Black Militia, the Not Fucking Around Coalition? That they go by the NFAC with Grandmaster. Do you know he was arrested yesterday? Grandmaster Jay, the leader of it. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. I didn't. I was put on a 12-hour, 14-hour yesterday, and
he was arrested yesterday for an indictment. They were in Louisville right the day before the Kentucky Derby. There was an anti-police protest that they marched in as in accordance with their right. They marched as they do armed in a militia formation. Apparently, he had on the end of his rifle a flashlight that officers swore out affidavits saying that they were on top of a building, and he shined his fist. He pointed his rifle at the top of that building, shining a flashlight at them. They feared for their life, and he was arrested yesterday for assault with a deadly weapon. Those officers testified that his light, he was on the ground. They were on top of it. His flashlight that was on his rifle blinded them from that flashlight, and they were afraid that he was going to discharge their weapons toward them, and they arrested him for those charges. Now, I don't know how far they were on top of a building and he was on ground level, yet they were blinded by his flashlights. I don't know how credible that allegation is. Does that make sense to you?
It makes perfect sense to me. I hope that these things are happening every day.
I also watched the coverage of that event as it was occurring. There was also a white militia that was also present there to counter them as well. I don't know of any indictments that came down against the white militia. Are you following me on this?
Man, it's wrong. I'm not going to try and find an eloquent.
But I was really shocked at how the officers, which were on top of some building elevated in the air, in their affidavits said we were blinded by his flashlights. I don't know how many lumens his flashlights were, but I would really be shocked that they were literally blinded by that flashlight. And again, the reason I'm bringing that up is I don't know how much they were exaggerating, or were they Testilying in their affidavit. But again, I'm not making any allegations or anybody. I'm just making a question is, were they exaggerating their testimony? Were they really blinded by that? Again, this will all be subject to cross-examination. But again, I'm just curious as to how accurate that testimony is in regards to the actual truth. And again, it's another example of officers maybe exaggerating the truth to accomplish an objective. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that has got to be looked at in regards to police reform and, to your point, legislation. It's just wrong.
But it also has to go to a point as the prosecutors have a duty as well.
Absolutely.
Again, they have. I'm sure that this entire thing was captured on video, and I'm sure it has a light. But they have a duty to see whether those officers were actually blind. You should be able to see in a camera whether that light was what blinded them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Or whether it was just a bright light that came across their field of vision. Again, whether the firearm was actually loaded or not, I don't have or whether he was looking across the field of was he looking through down looking through the optics on the rifle, or whether he was looking down through the sights on the barrel of the rifle. I can't give you an answer on that, But again, the entire
answer is plain and simple. And so from the county level to the legislator, they're connected. And then the police union are connected. And therein lies the problem. There's always, when you look at, a black militia being there and a white militia being there, and folks need to, understand what militias are. And they're perfectly legal. And it goes back to the Second Amendment, and it talks about militias and the right to bear arms and so forth. But the way the militias are looked at and how they're held accountable to law is very different. It is very different. How can you storm a state capitol with automatic rifles, assault rifles, and threaten a governor, a sitting governor at the state capitol, and you're locked and loaded? I don't care if you have a conceal and carry permit. I don't care if you can walk around with 15 ARs on your back. There's a time and a place for that. And we've got to set rules as to, you can't just go in public places with those types of weapons threatening people. Well, we weren't threatening. We just had them on us. Well, you were in a group of 50 or 100 and you stormed the Capitol. What are you talking about? That is gross intimidation.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. I watched both of those incidents, and you are absolutely correct. There are two different standards. Again, both groups were exercising their constitutional rights. The ironic thing was, in the Louisville incident, is the white militia and the NFAC, they actually had a mutual coming together moment at that time. It turned out to be a very peaceful coming. They actually joined together and had a very peaceful meeting in the middle. Ironically, at the end of that rally.
But some make it a point, Dan, in the state, and Louisville is very problematic, starting with, the Speaker of the House, not the Speaker of the House, but the Attorney General and the Senate. He's there. And Daniel Cameron. I don't understand that, getting to one social justice issue, which leads into a criminal justice issue, how there's a young woman that's killed on a no-knock warrant. She had nothing to do with anything in her home. And the charges that were brought about had nothing to do with her. It had to do with the apartment next door.
Well, that's there we go. Now we're back to what we previously discussed, and that again goes back to your holding your prosecutor accountable, and what type of prosecutor you want to have. Who controls
the prosecutor's office?
That's your electorate who controls your prosecutor's office. That's the people of Louisville and that county deciding what they want to have as their prosecutor. You as the electorate of Cook County decide who you want to control your prosecutions, and you elect. If you want a different prosecutor, if you want a progressive prosecutor who holds that, he decides it's his.
And what's his or her job title name?
In Cook County?
Yeah, not the name of the person, but who controls the prosecutors?
That's an independent authority. Independent authority. They have independent discretion to charge and to charge or not charge offenses in Cook County. Other than that, it would be the Attorney General of the state would make those decisions if they wanted to make it a statewide charge or the statewide grand jury. But other than that, in Cook County, that's Kim Fox's office.
Right. And in Louisville, that was whose office?
Forgive me, the name of the Attorney General slipped my mind. But you saw what charges he chose to bring. You saw how he shaded that entire investigation to go he wanted to do. That's the individual who should be held accountable for that. Absolutely.
And that was the point that I'm getting at. And that job is so political. And it goes and it ties back to state legislators and federal legislators. and they put who they want in those jobs and they push it, and the people appoint, but they'll put a figurehead there and say, oh, it's going to be fair. For example, if it's a Black person and, there's a lot of things going on in that particular area, no matter what the politics of that person is, they'll choose that person to go in that office sometimes, and egregious jurisdictions. For Chicago has been notoriously corrupt in everything, and there's so much seed of corruption going on. But the people are beginning to speak and be more informed as to who they're electing for judges and where these offices are, who's controlling the prosecutor's office, and so forth. So education of citizens as to who these judges are that you're just going down the ballot on. You need to understand who these people are. It might be that they shouldn't be in office. It might be that when the other person is in the contest with that person, that they're the better person or individual or professional to handle that. We've got to do better with our judges, electing them and finding out who they are, what their records are, and what they stand for, as just opposed to a name and guessing. That's crazy. And then for the Attorney General's office, I think that we're doing a better job of vetting and so forth, especially in Cook County, because it gets so ugly in the commercials, everything just comes out. But garbage in, garbage out, good information in sometimes gets filtered. But it's up to the citizen to understand these things, and we don't do a good job. We could do a good job of talking about it afterwards, but we don't do a good job in our homework to research who we're voting in office. And that includes police chiefs.
And I agree with that as well. The police chief, again, in Chicago, is yes, if that's an elected position, that I agree with that. I think your chief of law enforcement officer in Chicago is going to be the elected one is going to be that state's attorney position. I think you've got to place. If you want a progressive prosecutor, you've got to elect a progressive prosecutor. That's where you're going to have control over your prosecutions and your police, because that's where your control is. That's the one who's going to decide who you're going to prosecute your police. That's where your authority is at.
That is a very
I also want to bring up something that disturbed me the other day, when you said about judges yesterday. There was the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which opened up its conviction integrity unit a few years ago. Just a few days ago, along with the defense team, presented an agreed motion to vacate a prior conviction, but a judge refused it. So even though the attorney's office and the defense had agreed to vacate a prior conviction that they both agreed that there was not integrity there, the judge refused to do that, to accept their vacating a conviction. That's never happened before. So now you've got a new variable where the judge usually a judge will agree has always agreed to vacate it when the parties when it was an agreed vacation. Are you following me?
Yes.
Now we have a judge saying no. Now I need to be convinced. That's a disturbing trend. That's a disturbing development.
Yeah.
Where that's a hugely disturbing development. That throws that's now we need not only does the defense bar need to convince the conviction integrity units that an innocent man is behind bars and needs to be freed, and that your 13 or 30-year-old conviction is unjust. Now I've got to convince a judge.
This is beyond. This is just so beyond. And these are
that was the most disheartening.
Broken.
That was the most disheartening thing I've seen in years. What am I going to do to a client? I mean, could you imagine your client going? You go in there. You imagine being the lawyer going in there going, the hug you're going to get from your client. I've got the state's attorney's office on our side to agree that you're an innocent man. All we got to do is get the judge to sign off on it, and you're going home, baby. You're going home.
Wow.
And then you got to go in there and tell your client that the judge says no, he doesn't think you're an innocent man.
Yeah.
What? That's got to break some people's hearts.
There's an old saying, don't tell me, who's representing you. Tell me who the judge is.
Right. And the problem is the problem is that shouldn't even be part of the equation. Absolutely. And the problem is, and when that is part of the equation, it's you've got a fundamentally flawed system. Absolutely. When that's part of the equation. And the problem is that is, and many times that is part of the equation.
Yeah. And this is when you say our criminal justice system is based on democracy, and it's good. We've got a great frame, but it's not good enough. It's not good enough. And we need to fix it. And we need to face that it's broken. Yeah, we're the free leader of the world, and we'd like to think that everything is right. But even the Constitution has amendments. Come on.
But we need to stop thinking that we're the free leader of the world. We're students of the world, and we are capable of. We need to get over our arrogance.
Absolutely.
We can be students of the world. We don't have to be the best at everything, and we can look to other places to see where we can improve.
Absolutely, but the problem with that is that we've got such an ism going throughout our political dynamic and our system that if you admit to that you're still learning, then you're weak. And so there's an argument there with that, and it's a forceful argument. Whether I believe in it or not, or I agree with it or not, is irrelevant. It's there. And people have that, and they're very powerful, and they're in very powerful positions, but they need to understand, which is to your point, Dan, that we've got a new government administration coming in, and we've got a lot of people that are being rotated with the integrity and the system. I don't want to say, the integrity of old prior administrations, but then you've got a whole progressive agenda as well that needs to come to the table so that there can be a meeting of the minds to implement fair, positive, impactful change that will better our economy and society at large. If we are going to take a stand in the world, and lead by example. These past 4 years was leading by the United States and what we deeply believe, what many people deeply believe here. And it's rooted in isms and disparity, and it's just the same old business. But when you bring in diversity and thought, that's when you get really good ideas on the table. You can take them, model them, craft them, and make them better and make this country better. And we've got to do a better job of this. Our criminal justice system is broken. Our policing is broken. How do you take an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old with no education in regards to society? You've got your diploma or your GED, that's great. But you've not taken one course to understand society, one course to understand psychology and what goes behind people's thinking. And then you've not taken one diversity course to understand different people. If you're going in a different community than your own, you've got to understand what's there in order to police property. Then you take all of that academic knowledge that you've gotten from the academy and the laws, and you'll be a great officer. You'll be a great officer. The problem is, Dan, we've got people that came into the system at 18 and 21 years old and went into culture shock, and then just were led by corrupt officers and prosecutors and so forth, and the beat goes on, and then they unionized around it. And now you've got a great big old problem. Me, myself, I love our law enforcement. I love our country, our military, but that's not to say that it can never improve. I'm not arrogant enough to say, and thank God, that that's our military and it should never be improved. That's our government. It should never be improved. Those are our officers. Don't you dare say this or that against them. I will say what's right. And when it ain't right, it ain't right.
And I agree with you. And I think we do them a disservice by placing them in those positions where they're not being utilized correctly, and they're forced to make decisions that they shouldn't be forced to make. I believe if we gave them the proper training, we gave them the proper tools, they could make better decisions. They wouldn't be forced, because those decisions that they're making are having adverse effects on them too. That's why that's what their suicide in police is a constant problem, but it's because of the situations that they're being forced to be placed in because they're not properly trained. A police officer shouldn't be forced to deal with a psychiatric situation because he's not trained to deal with a psychiatric situation.
In no form. In any form whatsoever. I've got an autistic brother that lives with me, and he's nonverbal, and he ticks. After all of this upheaval over the last couple years, I am so afraid when he's in the car with me. God, it's almost going to bring me to tears that I have to go through this every time with him. He ticks so he can cope. He's in the front seat of my car. Can that be misconstrued? Will they kill him? He got away. He left out of my yard. He got out of the gate to take a walk, and he was on a busy intersection. I heard fire department and police sirens, and I'm looking for him. It's just second nature for me. I'm looking for him. And I said, the gate was locked. How did he get out of the gate? I just knew it. I knew it was him. And I went out, I run down the street, I'm screaming his name, and I have my son go out. He goes one way, I go another. And my son found him. He was in the middle of the street, 5 cop cars. They did not know what to do with him. The saving grace was this. We have a neighbor around the corner that's a nurse, both of them. They're a married couple, and they've dealt with disabilities such as he has. They were able to talk to him in a way that he would hold their hand, and he walked him across the street. Can you imagine the panic that was in my heart? My brother, he's a black guy. He looks normal. He doesn't look like he's, has any type of disability. So what would they have done to him? What could have happened to him? There needs to be more training.
Yes, there does. And yeah, because that could have gone horribly had there been somebody there who did not have the proper training. That could have gone incredibly wrong. Over a person could have gone incredibly wrong, incredibly bad. Yeah. And you were blessed to have somebody there who knew how to deal with that situation. And that's what we have to have. That's what has to happen in this country. That's what has to happen. You see so many incidents of that where police should not be in that situation, where if there was just somebody there who all it took was somebody to hold his hand.
That's all.
Instead of hitting him with a taser. Hold his hand instead of hitting
yelling
him with
and screaming.
Unbelievable. Just to hold his hand solved it. That's such an answer.
Yes.
Hold his hand. Such an answer.
That's why I tell you, I've seen so many of these things up close and personal, that it's just mind-blowing. Just mind-blowing, the lack of training and the amount of reform that's needed. So I want to implore everyone out there, stop resisting training and reform. These things are needed. These things, it not only happens to Black people, it happens to white people, Asian people. We need training, proper training for our police officers. We need proper reform in our criminal justice system. Very oftentimes, if you don't have a very intelligent, I shouldn't say intelligent because I like to think that all attorneys are intelligent, but if you don't have an attorney that stays up on the laws and is well-versed and not overworked in the system, you can't get a good defense sometimes. And you're fighting an uphill battle. And then even if that attorney is trained to the extent and is skilled, and he goes into that court system and he's overwhelmed with the prosecutor and the state's attorney and the state legislation and the federal legislation, the congressman, everybody's in on it, you don't have a fighting chance because the judge is owned. And please understand, I've got a lot of judge friends. They are not all like this, but there are some that are vulnerable to this. So we need to enact laws so that they can properly come up with decisions and opinions that are going to not cause harm.
Yes, I agree with that, and I think you're absolutely correct that there is which your sentiment is correct. Is there's a lot of that bureaucracy in criminal justice system as well. A lot of the cogs of the machine, and I think that's a disservice as well. I think there's a substantial amount of that as well. And that is just that's the nature of the system. That is the nature of the system. I think that is the nature of the system. And that's just inherent in the size of the system as well.
Yes.
I can't give you an answer on that. You've got to take each case individually and try to avoid that aspect of the system with your individual case.
Yes. And that's where, the attorneys and their caseload and what they're doing can be impactful because they have an obligation as well. But citizens have an obligation also not to look at movements just because it doesn't say white, it says Black, to understand that movement and what's behind it, which is criminal justice reform, social justice issues that need to come to the table, et cetera. I had a conversation with someone the other day, and he had the biggest flag behind him, and he was toting an AR-15 in his picture. And he wrote to me in a comment, Black Lives Matter movement is a communist terrorist group. And my first inclination was don't even respond to him because these people can get out of control sometimes. But what I did, I always bring the fact, and I'm always mild in my temperament, or I always try to be mild in my temperament when dealing with difficult situations and difficult people. And I just gave him the background of the Black Lives Matter movement and their founders. I said, well, two of the founders are Marxists, and they say that they're trained Marxists. That has nothing to do with the fact that they say that we do not, and our intention was never to be head of the movement. It was a hashtag, and we started a viral hashtag, but it's the people's movement. It's up to people to make change and to progress. We led it with Black Lives Matter, just like they want to change it to All Lives Matter so that it's more inclusive. Of course, all lives matter. But when there's disproportionate injustices and disparities and inequities that are just grossly imbalanced, there needs to be a light shone on that. And the light is to show you that when I went through some of the statistics in the beginning of this podcast, showing you where the disparities are, that breeds a lot of these problems, along with the policing and the law enforcement rules that are on the books. And we need to start there. That is what the Black Lives Matter movement is. It's not to say that I'm better than you, Dan. You're white. I'm black. I'm so much better than you. And I matter. You matter. I would stand up for anyone. The problem is that people become tribal. They become tribal in their own communities. It could be black, white, Asian, whatever. They become tribal, and then they listen to a certain news feed. It could be CNN, MSNBC, could be Fox News, and that begins to be their cycle of information. Learn how to Google. As my oldest sister would say, the Google.com is your greatest research, and make sure it's fact-based. Check the agencies out before you start citing them, because a lot of agencies are biased. And so it's up to us as individuals to change it. It's up to humanity to change it. I'm so encouraged because when I look back and I saw folks protesting in France and Sweden and Norway and the UK because of George Floyd, a black man in the United States. They saw it. And guess what? These weren't all black people. That is what I said. We're getting it right now. We're getting it right.
And it is time.
Right.
And it is
takes
time.
The whole village.
It does take the whole village, and yes, and I'm not even going to comment on that. All lives matter. That takes away from the focus. Needs to be on Black Lives Matter. I can rattle off Emmett Till. I can just go historically. I can consider Trayvon Martin. The focus. No, it's
my
the focus.
Father. I will go to my father and give that instance. It's crazy.
The focus isn't the focus. The focus needs to be where the harm is being done, and the harm is being done into the Black community. Yes, I'm not even going to say that phrase because that's not need to be right now. We need to heal where the harm is being done. The harm is being done in our Black.
Dan, you said it perfect. We need to heal where the harm is being done. And wherever it is, we can fix it. We've got a great democracy. We've got a great frame, but it needs change.
Exactly. So great. We're all in this together, and those are our brothers who need our healing and our help now. We all matter, but those are our brothers who need us now, and that's who we're here for now. We're all in this together. That's who we're here for now. They're the ones we're emphasizing for. They're the ones we're here for. My definition that we're here for their struggle now, and they're the ones we're focusing on now. And we're not going to be done with them until they're hit with where the rest of us are. And that's all we're focused on now. That's the bottom line.
Absolutely.
Until little Black children are not hiding behind cars because when police cars are driving down the street, this struggle will not be over. And I hope you know what video I'm talking about. Yeah. Until they feel safe enough not to hide from police cars, this is not going to be over.
Absolutely.
Until they feel the same as I did when a cop could run towards a police car. Until they feel the same, this isn't over.
Yes.
This will not be over until they feel the same way.
Yeah, because that starts in our criminal justice system. Therein lies where it starts, and we need gross reform. And we need
exactly. This is a struggle. And any person of goodwill knows that this is a struggle. This is a struggle that's it's going on. This country was founded on this struggle. This goes back. I was a founder. I am a big fan of the 1619 Project. I don't know if you've spent any time with listening to that podcast or examining that. I would highly recommend it. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating historical project.
It's a Pulitzer Prize winning project.
Deservedly so. And as a historian, you did mention I have a degree in history. I was profound. It was incredibly done. I don't believe it's revisionist history. I believe it's an honest analysis of the foundation of this country. I believe it's a fresh analysis, and I do examine it. I do believe that we do have a white supremacist history, and I do believe that the to look at Black history in this country is that there's only one word to examine it: is struggle. And I do think that
it seems like it's been a perpetual struggle. The psychology around it to get over it as a Black person is to have the foundation laid that every time there's a crack, you patch over it and you keep walking and you keep moving. And that's the community that I was raised in. But I was lucky. I was blessed to have a mom and a dad that worked around the clock. There were 10 kids in my family. Are you kidding me? You know, we owned our home. I don't care how small it was. My dad didn't take a loan out for the house because you had to pay a bribe in our community to get a loan. And so it became unaffordable at that point. He worked 3 jobs. He worked as a paper cutter at the Burroughs Corporation, which was part of White Flight that left our community. He delivered juice on the weekends, and he was a mechanic. He went to a mechanic school after his paper cutting, or during while he's a paper cutter, and he became a mechanic. There was always a car in our garage, always. He kept food on our table. I cannot recall a hungry day. I cannot recall not having 3 meals a day. He would be furious if my mom went to work because he said it was important for her to teach us what schools didn't teach us, which was manners and morals and values and tradition and culture. He held her to account for that, and she held him account for the finances, and it worked. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but guess what? I thought we were growing up because everybody came to our little house to eat. They loved my mother's food. They could smell it. She was a great baker, and we were a house of love. We were a community of love. My neighbors had 7 kids. We were best friends growing up. You know, around the block, there was a boatload of kids. We had races, but I could talk about my childhood until the cows come home. The communities aren't like that anymore. They're broken down. There's no mom and dad in the house. You know, there's a dad or a mom, but I tell you, this new generation, they may not be together, the 20-somethings that are having kids, but I'm going to tell you, those dads, if they have girls, they're part of those girls' lives. They're part of those. That is a saving grace. I am so encouraged by what I see. Now, if we could just stop the madness with this crazy policing and these crazy laws, mandatory laws on the books, to give people a fighting chance to make a living and contribute to society. Everybody's not bad in any particular race. There's bad people in every race. But I tell you, the human element, more people want to have and be productive than the ones that don't. There are more people like that. And if we bet on people in this country, that's how we got our democracy and our frame. If we take a bet on people, we'll be okay.
And I absolutely agree with that. And yes, we do need to. That is the answer. The answer is to bet on those people. The answer is to give them an opportunity for an opportunity to lift themselves, to lift them out of their situation. And I bet they would. I know that they would give themselves a hand up. I know that they would take that opportunity and they would not squander it. And they would. We could change this situation and we could change this world if they've given that opportunity. Dr. King once wrote, a country that spends more on military might than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And I think we are living that.
Yeah, that's our reality right now. That is
our reality right now. We are living that.
You know what's encouraging to me is that this movement encompasses so many people that don't look like you and don't look like me necessarily. It's everybody looking. You look around and you're like, wow, what is going on here? This is great. And then you talk to these people. That's getting to know your neighbor. That's getting to know your community, not just where you live in your block party. It's getting to know other people and their dynamic. It is then that real change is going to happen because we're denouncing ignorance and we're implementing and impacting real change.
And this might be the dawn of that age. It might be with the internet, with the world might be coming to. You are exactly correct. We might be coming to that dawn of that age where we can be connected, where that change can come about, where we know that we can no longer be voices crying out in the wilderness. We know that we are there are people of goodwill out there, that our dreams of that brother and sisterhood of goodwill.
Yes.
Of goodwill.
Yes.
Man, if we just get together and say no, that we can stand up to that wall. To that wall we can stand up to that wall and say, no, we're going to go through that wall.
Absolutely.
No, absolutely not. We're not going to leave anyone behind.
Yeah.
And we're not going to give up on this struggle. We're not going to give up on, we're not going to leave anyone behind, and we're not going to give up on this struggle. And just like Dr. King said, we're going to get to that promised land.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to be we're going to get there, and we're going to get him there. And
Absolutely.
we're not going to leave anybody behind. And when we do get there, we're going to give thanks for everybody who helped get us here. But
Absolutely.
we are going to get there, and
yes.
we're not going to forget those who came before us.
Yeah, and you don't forget your past and your history. You don't forget.
Absolutely, and we're not going to forget
you move
that.
on, but you don't forget it, because if you forget it, you're subject to repeat it, and that's our problem. It's so many people that want to forget things and just shove it under the rug. What is that ever accomplishment? What's done in the dark will always come to the light.
That's exactly correct, and we will learn from it, and we will learn from it, and we'll be better because of it.
Yes, I believe that. So with that said, Dan, I think we've had a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I so appreciate your time. I appreciate your passion, your intelligence, your integrity, just your will to want to see things change. And I encourage you to just not give up. I know every day you probably look at things and just get so discouraged. How could you not some days? But I want you to know that what you do is so appreciated. You are so valued. And I just want more Dans in the world to just fight where they can, where they are, and then chip away at things that can be better by bringing to light on a simple podcast that I'm a relative unknown. But if 3,000 people can see this, if I can send this to the governor, if I can send this to our federal or state legislators, they'll understand from a guy that sees this every day in our system what needs to be fixed and where to start, without putting together a big task force and saying, okay, now where do we start? And 2 years later, you're still at the beginning. No, Dan is telling you where to start. It starts with legislators. It starts, and that's state and federal. It starts with judges and the legislation, non-mandatory sentencing. It starts with police union reform and legislators holding the union to account with legislation. It starts, if we could start with those things and stop criminalizing people for the rest of their lives for offenses that they made a mistake with, giving them opportunity, people will have hope. People will have hope that things are changing and they'll get in on it. I guarantee you, because there's more good people than there are bad.
And don't detract the role of prosecutors. It starts with prosecutors doing the right thing as well, and them having the same type of examining their roles. Not so much as that white badge. I want them to have the same heart. I want them to look at people as human beings. I don't want them to look at everybody as I want them.
1, 2, 3.
That's correct. I want them to think about people at 30. I want them to look at the ways as how can we help this individual as well, to restore them as well. I do understand that they have a role to protect society, but I also want them to understand that they're dealing with an individual here as well. We all have a role of restorative justice. Yes, they have a duty to protect society. Yes, they have a duty to help them to protect the victim, but they don't have a duty to look for a pound of flesh.
I agree. And with that, our guest attorney, Dan Collins, has given tremendous insight on the criminal justice system, what's broken, what's right, and what needs reform, models we can look at. I implore you all to share this with other family members and other community to learn and be a part of solving some of these problems and not being part of the problem. And with that said, my name is Bridget. This is the Souls of Many. Real talk, real people, real news, all the time. Thank you for listening.